Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching this. And super excited to welcome to Jeanne Garbarino, Dr. Jeanne Garbarino, the director of Rock EDU at the Rockefeller University. I want to share you a quick story. I had met Jeanne at the customer conference. At least so it was known back then. They changed the name, I've heard. And she was giving a talk about Rock EDU and all the wonderful things they're doing. And I was just blown away. Okay, let me just say that. And I knew that I had to email you and know you and connect with you. And I've done exactly that. And so this is just wonderful that we've managed to connect here again and hear more about Rock EDU, your own story, and thinking about science outreach and inclusive building, right? As we venture into week 4 of this program, we're now getting into this more case studies and delving deeper into specific organizations and what they're doing and how they're doing it. So we get to do kind of under the microscope things and so forth. So with that, Jeanne, I won't spoil too much of what you're going to say with your narrative. I'll leave you to it. Guys, again, please drop questions in the chat or raise your hand. I will be looking at the list there. Jeanne, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody thank you for, that was a lovely introduction. I'm very humbled. I'm so glad that we were able to connect and that Rock EDU has resonated with you. Rock EDU is definitely something that is very near and dear to my heart. I started it in 2012. Basically, I was a postdoc doing biomedical research in heart disease. But really, I found so much joy at connecting science with audiences that were not necessarily my peers in the lab. And I also feel very strongly about building stronger communities between the scientific world and worlds that maybe don't have access to science, or maybe want to, do more with science and build trust in science. And so, and coming from my own personal upbringing, this was really important to me. I am a kid from the Bronx. I actually still live in the Bronx, and my parents did not have college degrees. I actually am a product of a teenage pregnancy. It was really difficult for me to navigate the system, and I'm literally here because I'm very annoying and persistent. But I'm certain that there are many people who are passionate and intelligent and are smart and are just not necessarily given the opportunities to explore science in the way people should have the opportunity to explore science. And so that really fuels me in my own work. And so today I'm very excited to share with you sort of the structural mechanisms of science outreach and how I try to integrate in all that we do at Rock EDU science into a framework that is nested in society. Science does not take place in a vacuum. And so we have to acknowledge that science is done by humans. And because of that, science is not actually objective, right? It's done through the lens of human experience. And so how can we make that more accessible to everyone? Okay, so I'm going to start with this wonderful quote from one of my favorite authors and activist, Adrienne Maree Brown. This is something that she wrote in her book, Emergent Strategy, which is a really great book for organizing, if this is of interest to you. And if a movement is not grounded in a vision of deep systemic change, it is ultimately a misuse of our time. We don't have a lot of time on this planet, and I certainly don't want to be working 24/7. So I feel very strongly that we have to move fast, we need to fail hard, and we need to iterate, and we need to build something that is accessible to all. So before I get into the elements, or before I get into the framework of science outreach, I do want to just contextualize it that we have to think about science outreach in terms of the values. What value do we want to create with science outreach? What's the theories behind, you know, some of the research that's taking place? What seems to be the right way to do things? And then how does that integrate with practice? All right, so those are the three elements of sort of the work of science outreach. But science outreach exists in a society where that society is really dictated by, you know, systems, people, and power, right? And so when we overlap those, it's sort of like science outreach exists in society, and it leads to actions, right? And those actions are influenced by like this whole kind of network. And the network is in turn also influenced by the actions that are taking place. And because we can use our actions to influence this network, I believe that we can shift how science can be done to make sure it's a more inclusive place. All right, so what is science outreach? Let's take a look at these mechanics. The definition that I've come up with, and this is based on a number and many years of discussions, I think of science outreach as a framework, right? And we have inward stakeholders and outward stakeholder communities. We have goals, and we have the application of context-specific best practices, right? So what does that actually break down as, right? So the inward stakeholders are those who are doing the work. So they're sort of thinking about it. They have the resources. They're reaching out to non-scientific or non-specialist audiences. And then the outward stakeholder are the people sort of being engaged by the inward stakeholder. A goal is the reflection on what both the inward and outward groups want to achieve. It is not possible to apply a single set of best practices to all of science outreach. There's so many different ways that science outreach can take place. And so it's really important that you're adapting your processes to meet the people where they are. And the outcome of this really needs to be mutual learning. Like, as a scientist, I want to learn something from my community, and in turn, I hope my community learns something from me. And, you know, again, science is done by humans, work is done by humans. All of this is human-centered. And so we have to take the time to listen to the people involved in all of this, scientists and non-scientists, so that we can make sure everyone has a seat at the table. And so when you think about implementing the science outreach framework in your setting, you first need to obviously identify who will be involved, and that's both the inward and outward. You're going to try to figure out what are those goals, and each of those groups will have specific goals, and those goals do not have to be overlapping. For example, a scientist might be involved in science outreach because they need to have some professional development, whereas an outward stakeholder might want to learn how a vaccine works. You can still make that work. You also want to tailor those strategies, right? So you're tailoring and applying those context-specific best practices, and you end up having everybody learn something. All right, so who are the stakeholders? And this can be a little tricky, right? It's important to know your audiences, but humans are tricky, right? So we'll just, for the sake of clarity, we'll say inward is the sort of group that is doing, and outward is the group that is in receiving, right? And so you can think about the inward and outward communities as individuals, right? Inwards might be a student or a postdoc, some sort of a staff member or an educator, where an outward stakeholder might be a student, teacher, or patient, or a voter. November 3rd, everybody, vote not number, that, you know, just throwing that in there. But you can also think about the stakeholders as not just individuals, but groups of people. If you can imagine that I might have my own individual values, but those values are for sure shaped by the groups that I belong to, right? And so this could be, you know, I'm making them very sciencey, but you can, you know, choose any number of groups to sort of consider as examples. You know, inward might be your entire lab or your club, or an outward could be a classroom, or, you know, a community group. And then all of that is nested inside of a community, right? And so you can think of the community as a stakeholder as well. And that could maybe be an institution or a government, where an outward could be an elementary school or a nursing home as examples. And so these are social structures, right? And everything is nested, and the community, the group, and the individual are all influencing how all of that sort of operates in our society. And when you are building an inclusive science outreach framework, in order for it to have like a really good integrity, it really needs the ability to influence that overall structure. And I think acknowledging this can really open up a lot of channels for measuring impact. And that, I think, is of extreme value when you are trying to assess the effectiveness of your work. All right, so talking about assessing the effectiveness, you have to first start out with really solidifying what it is you want to achieve, and then figuring out how will you know that you achieved it. It's not really prudent to necessarily say, I'm gonna make everybody better, or make science literacy a better thing in society. That is just really, really large and lofty, right? And so it's important to think about goals in ways that are reasonable. And goal setting is probably the #1 activity that I do every time I dream up an initiative. It is the most critical piece of the science outreach framework. They have to be clear. Again, like the example of improving science literacy for all Americans as an example, that is not realistic. That is not achievable by a single person. And that's actually not clear, because what does science literacy actually mean? This is a small segue, but science literacy has not been defined, and that is because it cannot be measured. And I think it's really important to consider that, like, as I had mentioned previously, that your goals can be different for different stakeholder groups. And so if you are really looking to get that buy-in from everyone, you have to sort of really figure out ways to integrate the goals into the design of your work. And this is really essential for measuring impact. But just like the process of scientific research, you have to try things, fail, reflect, and iterate, and then do that cycle again, right? So this is a learning experience. And one of the frameworks that I really enjoy for goal setting is the sort of the SMART, right? And this is an acronym where S is specific. This is exactly what you want to accomplish: measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. You want to make sure that you are giving yourself a solid timeline that, by December 1st, I'm going to see if this works. And they can be very narrow. They can be, I really want to influence girls who are aged 9 to see themselves as a biochemist by the end of this session, right? It's really easy to be very specific. So, but how do we learn what those outward stakeholder goals are, right? We can't assume that our outward audiences want the same thing as what we want, or we can't assume that, a group of, 15-year-olds are going to be a specific way because that's our experience as a 15-year-old, right? So it's really important that you talk with the people who are your target audience to figure out, what do you want? We're going to do this thing together. You said that you want this thing. What is it specifically that you want to get out of this? And if you can't actually talk to that target audience, another thing you can do is maybe speak with colleagues who have had experiences in those contexts. Or even better, go and see what things are like in that community. And one thing that feels very confusing, especially when you're talking about grants, right? And I know that you're going to be talking about funding next week, right? And that's the differentiation and the intimate relationship between goals, outcomes, and metrics, right? Goals is the thing that you set out to achieve. This is what I want to do. And the outcome is the thing that actually happens. And then the metrics is the thing that you're reporting out, like this worked or this didn't work. Again, reflection and iteration will help promote your SMART goals and help you demonstrate that your work is valuable and impactful. And asking the question, how does my goal match my outcome, is one of the most essential questions that you can ask, especially when you're designing your grants. All right, so there's, thinking about formal metrics, you also want to think about like why you want a formal metric. Are you planning on writing a paper, or is a stipulation for your funding, or are you skills, or are there reasons other than professional? And this may not be as relevant to this group, but some people just want to do science outreach because they believe in giving back. So it's very altruistic. That is not necessarily something that we should be putting value on in an artificial way, because it already is extremely valuable. So I just urge you to think about, the personal motivations for doing this work. All right. So some of the examples of the assessments that we've done vary. We do a lot of surveys. We try to think about our students in the moment. So you can also have a lot of stories or collect quotes. But one of the most tried and true things that we do is called an exit slip or an exit ticket. This is like after we have a specific session, we might have, a set of 2 questions. One around, depending on what our goals are usually, we want our students to absorb the content that we're providing them, and we want them to develop a sense of identity in science. They see themselves as scientists, right? And so we might ask a question about like how they felt about something from a personal perspective, and then we might ask them to recall a specific piece of data or a specific, element of the lesson that resonated with them. We also report on thank you letters and cards as an example. And one of the really beautiful sort of assessment tools that we've recently incorporated is called the Photo Voice Project. This was originally developed, I think in the 90s, don't quote me on that, by some community engagement groups in China. And they realized that folks either, when you're thinking about getting feedback in written form, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of barriers too, especially in terms of language and things like that. So what they suggested is you give a prompt and then ask students or ask your audience to take a picture and share a picture that best summarizes whatever the prompt is that you've given them. And what we found in our work at Rockefeller is, we do all these K through 12 initiatives, is that our students resonate in 3 ways. They resonate with the people, so their mentors, their peers. They resonate with the architecture of the campus. So we know that we need to incorporate a lot of like sort of tours of cool places in campus in our future programming. Well, when we can go back there. And they also resonate with the science itself. So things like pipetting or microscopes or something like that. And that was really informative for us to think about how we iterate and improve on the existing programs that we have, and sort of foregoing the subjective nature sometimes of trying to analyze text. But sometimes for us, I'm thinking about, for us, we usually have scientists and non-scientists, and it's really, really difficult to assess or to evaluate our programs when we have non-scientists coming from all sorts of different backgrounds. They are minors. You need approval from an institutional review board to collect human data. That seems very difficult to us sometimes, especially when you're only seeing someone once or maybe twice at most. And so I like to actually think about the work that we do from an inward perspective. I like to think about, how can I influence the culture of science outreach at the Rockefeller University? How can I get more scientists to participate? How can I get them to think about best practices in culturally responsive mentorship? How can I, can I influence people to go into science outreach as their career? And how does this change the overall climate of our university? And over the years, what we've learned when we think about systemic change, and I'm just drawing back from that original quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, is, when we can really build that good foundation, and I have access to all of these scientists, so it's really much easier for me to cultivate that inclusive environment, that sort of is this bottom up growing of an environment that just feels like people can enter it without feeling intimidated, right? And what I've learned is that, and we do a lot of our work is very volunteer based. Scientists volunteer for our programs. Before I bring anybody on, I ensure that I'm providing a structure and clear expectations. What is the purpose of what we're doing? What do I expect of you? How can you learn? What do we get out of it, right? And I'm extremely transparent, and I never let anybody participate without giving some level of training or guidance. And I'm always there to help navigate issues or challenges. And sometimes it's really fun to do that. I also believe in empowering and supporting the people that are involved in our work, right? And I never say no to a meeting if somebody wants to talk about outreach. I try to take everybody, everybody's concerns are valid, and I want to do what I can to help bring an idea to fruition, even if it doesn't necessarily benefit Rocky to you, but it does uphold our mission of connecting more people to science. And lastly, and this is one that I think has been severely lacking in a lot of our contexts, and I don't mean to speak on your behalf, but I find it really hard when people don't give feedback, right? And so I try personally in my leadership to always make sure that I am giving and normalizing and acting on feedback, right? And it's not just pointing out when somebody is doing something wrong. It's also pointing out that, hey, this is working, keep going, I appreciate this, right? And when we show that we respond to people's needs through this acting on that feedback, we can build trust and people feel that their investment is worthwhile. And this is just an example of how I've been able to utilize both the framework and sort of these core tenets to bring people together for the purposes of science outreach. This is only a subset of people who are involved in putting on a science festival for little kids. We do this every year in normal circumstances. We all wear the same t-shirt, and it's just such a wonderful community builder, and I never am lacking for involvement, and that's because I invest in the work that everybody is doing from a human perspective, and I think that's super key. All right, so what is your science outreach plan? How are you going to get there? And so before you think about your tailored strategy, I think you need to do a little self-assessment, right? Or your group should do some self-assessment. Like, what is your capacity? How much time do you have to dedicate to both the planning and the execution? And then I'll also add to the reflection and possible mapping out of iteration. How many people do you have involved? What is your funding? What kind of space do you have? What are the supplies that you need? And what are the supplies that you can actually get? What are the skills or know-how? And, thinking about permissions and buy-in. And so when you take stock of what is possible versus what is not possible, it's really easy to manage. It's much easier. It's not always really easy, but it's much easier to manage those expectations and give the people the feedback that they really require. And I think it's important to try to not reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of examples of what's going on already. It just takes some time to do some research or maybe talking with folks to think about evidence-driven practices to build an engagement plan. You can participate in some workshops or classes, depending on what you want to do. But for me, I really feel that science outreach and the work that we're doing in the K through 12 space embodies the best practices of science communication, public engagement, and informal education. And yes, those are technically 3 different things, though I think I've drawn them as separate entities, but they are so overlapping in so many ways. Sometimes it becomes difficult to separate them. But in any case, that engagement strategy that you're building really needs to meet the social, cultural, and linguistic needs of your outward stakeholders. And then, you know, everybody's learning something, right? So as an example, an inward stakeholder can learn about community or to build their relationships, improve their network. Maybe they want to do a better job at being culturally competent, and this helps them to exercise a lot of that. They want to go into teaching, communication, you know, or whatever. And whereas an outward stakeholder can think about an element of science or piece of content or connect with members of the scientific community, build trust with science or the process of science or scientists, and other things too. So what is science outreach in terms of its guiding principles, right? It's really about people, because science outreach is indeed for everyone. And I love that, I really love Angela Davis's work. She's a civil rights activist, author, and just overall badass. And this quote, I think, is really, really, you know, a lot of people say, oh, science outreach, that's our mechanism, right? And nobody sort of does any other work in institutions. And so this quote, I think, really resonates. I have a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice. Diversity is a corporate strategy. It's a strategy designed to ensure that the institution functions in the same way that it functioned before, except now you have some Black faces and brown faces. It's a difference that doesn't make a difference. And so a lot of the work that we are doing is to, we want to make sure communities, there's so many untapped communities, and how do we make sure that we can open up the channels for more people to participate in science while also shifting the culture of the current institution so that people who are from untapped communities can feel like they belong there, right? And I don't think I think, you know, these are conversations that we're having as a society at large, but diversity is not the same as inclusivity. I'm not sure that this, I like to say this out loud, even though maybe this is something that most folks are starting to recognize. And one of the analogies is diversity is getting an invitation to a party, but inclusivity is when you actually are having a good time there, right? And diversity is really easy to measure. You can think about all of the personal identifiers that that somebody might have, and say, hey, I have representation from XYZ, right? But that doesn't mean that that person is thriving in that environment, right? And it really requires human to human connection, and thinking about changes to enhance both recruitment and retention in whatever it is that you're doing. I know I'm talking very specifically about, you know, research institution because that is my context, but I believe that this can be applied broadly. I also think it's really important that, you know, when you think about your science outreach framework, that you're developing skill sets that build meaningful relationships, and not just sort of like, hey, this person was in my class, but like, you know, Jared, you know, is here and he has a little sister that sometimes he has to babysit. And so I know that he has to leave a little early because his parents have to head to work and he has to be the caretaker, right? So I'm not gonna take points off or penalize him for any of this. And I think that really, you know, empathy is one of the most critical components of cultural competency, and building meaningful relationships. Can you put yourself in the shoes of the audience? Also communication, right? Are you using the right tone? Are you choosing the words in a thoughtful and an intentional way? And conversely, communication is not just about, you know, you sharing, but it's also about you listening. Are you really listening? I also think one of the keys to being successful in science outreach is flexibility. Can you identify when something is not quite right? right? And how do you shift gears to make sure that you are meeting the needs and capacity of what it is that you're doing? And by having an open mind and an ability to shift gears as needed, I think this is where you can really maximize that potential for reciprocity and that mutual learning element that is critical for the science outreach framework. All right, so what does this all look like in practice? And I'm going to give you a very sort of brief overview of Rocky DU science outreach. And I'm pitching everybody in the world that people should stop doing science outreach as little tiny clubs, and people and institutions to put their money where their mouth is and create centralized offices with adequate funding and adequate staff and adequate influence to be able to do their jobs in a way that is effective and impactful. So the mission of our program at Rocky DU, we are the science outreach program of Rockefeller University, and we work to create and support a science outreach framework that brings together scientific and non-scientific communities, largely K through 12 students and teachers, in order to promote a broad appreciation for the process of science and foster a genuine connection between science and society. We are not necessarily interested in creating a future army of scientists, but we do want people to see science as an element of everyday life and as something that they can engage with without saying, oh, science is hard, or I'm not going to understand that, or I can't see anybody like me doing this type of work, so therefore I shall not do this type of work. And so for us as a program, right, we really want to promote and support a culture of science outreach that aligns with the primary research goals. Again, this is a biomedical research facility. The work that we do is world renowned. My colleague, Charlie Rice, just won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine yesterday for his work, his contributions along with other scientists, and PS, along with a giant team of people to help him get there, that ended up being able to stop hepatitis C. So that was really, really incredible news yesterday. And so that's the primary research goal, right? Science for the benefit of humanity, but humanity also means making sure all of humanity has access to this. And so that's why I really, really push for our program. And for our outward stakeholders, I really think it's important for people in general to understand that science is done by humans. It is incremental. It is both reliable and tentative. You know, we know what we know because of what tools and resources we have at the time. And if other types of technologies or other types of sort of insights are met in the future, that could change what we think as dogma, right? And, you know, I like this baseball analogy, although my colleagues hate when I say this, but I love the sport of baseball. You know, I grew up near Yankee Stadium. I've been going to baseball games my entire life. And I think sometimes I feel that people think that science is, the process of science takes place where, you know, a baseball player goes up to bat and just, like, you know, hits home runs after home runs. When really the way baseball is played is, you know, the goal is to just get on base. And so you might be hitting a single or a double or a fly out or a bunt or something, right? You're not hitting home runs every time you go up to bat. And that's how science is done. And so important is equity, right? Making sure that there's equity in terms of access, in terms of opportunity, and keeping it genuine to the process of science. So you're not letting go of the rigors that are required of science and just supporting everybody as they get there. And so the challenge that we had is, how do we create this accessible, you know, programs that are accessible, that can serve both our inward audiences, which is our scientists, and our outward audiences, which are K through 12, in New York City, in a school system with 1.1 million students, and that's just public schools, right? And so we came up with a number of programs that that sort of have different types of entry points to accommodate the diversity of interests and diversity of time and capacity. And so I'm just going to talk about, so these are, you can learn a lot about this on our website. I don't want to take too much time because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But I want to talk really quickly about Lab Jumpstart as our example. It is, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this out loud, but it is my favorite program of all time. And so here, you know, when we think about science and who is doing science, especially at upper levels, you know, one thing is so clear. It is very white and very male. And so how can we support, you know, people from untapped backgrounds to participate in science and not feel that because the enterprise is currently dominated by a specific culture that they don't belong, right? And so this is what influenced the creation of Lab Jumpstart. And we have funding from the Pinkerton Foundation to support 16 high school students, where we work with them over 14 weeks in the spring after school to get them up to speed so that they can join labs and do research in a Rockefeller laboratory. We are doing these things virtually right now, but ideally the aim is to jumpstart research skills and lab culture, exposure to lab culture. And so when we think about goals, we see that, you know, students are supported through training in the basic research environment, you know, in an inclusive environment. We give them capacity to build professional skills like LinkedIn profiles, how to write emails, how to build a resume, thinking about college access, stuff like that. And also just showing how to ask good questions and be critical in their thinking. And the scientists and trainees who work with us here, you know, they're getting huge teaching and mentoring experiences, and they're learning how to manage teams and just thinking about the best practices in education. And so this is just one example of the programs that we run and sort of how we're breaking it down. Okay, so I'm going to end it here, and I hope that that something was gleaned from this talk. And maybe now we can have a little bit of a conversation about any of this. I'd love to hear your questions.
That was fantastic, Jeanne. I think there's so much to grab on there and discuss that I will refrain as much as I can.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to open it up.
Yeah, please feel free to jump in and ask Jeanne any questions or comments. And don't be shy. You can just unmute yourselves. Okay.
Hi, Jeanne. I actually had a quick question for you.
Sure.
So first off, I think Lab Jumpstart, sorry, I don't want to mess up the name, sounds
that's okay.
Really, really fantastic and awesome. And I kind of want to get your opinion on what like the next step past that is. Because I mean, for a perfect example, you said your colleague recently won the Nobel Prize in physiology. And that same day, NPR ran an article about how the Nobel Prize has been largely whitewashed. And I think something like Jumpstart Lab is what is needed to kind of bridge that current gap. But how do you see the next step progressing? Because keeping people from untapped communities in the STEM fields and actively progressing to the level where they get to the PI status or the physician status where they can make the kind of grand level impact and be the face for like the next generation behind them of untapped community, it's great to get people in the door, but where do you see like opportunities for increasing longevity?
Yeah, and this is really key, and this is why I've been turning inward. I'm just going to comment on the Nobel Prize right now. It's such a conflict because, like, you know, I do know many Nobel laureates, not to like name drop or anything, and I know that they do great work, but at the same time, the Nobel Prize, in terms of, I'll just throw gender out there. Out of all the Nobel Prizes that have been awarded in the history of the Nobel Prize, 2% are women, 2%. And the number is so much more minuscule for people of color. And when you think about how much work has been done by so many people and to have their achievements overlooked, you know, you'll see I got in a lot of trouble last year actually for bashing the Nobel Prizes I got sent to the principal's office, and this year I tried to you know, temper my reaction, but you'll see like on my tweets, it's like, congrats, Charlie, but also how about some Jedi training for the Nobel Prize Committee, right? And I see that as like a really big issue. But to address your questions of longevity, this is why I feel so strongly about turning inward and shifting the culture of science itself. Science is a culture, you know, when we think about how science emerged as a profession, like it really happened in the 1800s where you had a bunch of like elite dudes who are just like, let's look at my test tubes, right? And it's just like a bunch of Europeans, like kind of like, you know, colonialist kinds of mentalities. And they built this thing through their lens, right? And so it is absolutely like logical for the culture of science to match the people who've constantly been running the show, right? And I feel very strongly that equality to the privileged can sometimes feel like oppression, right? And so I think that is one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to shift the culture, is because there's this idea of this false idea, in my opinion, of a meritocracy, you know, that only the people who did the work should be given the opportunity. But when you shut that door on huge amounts of untapped communities at age 7, how the hell are they supposed to get to the point to be able to showcase their work, right? And so I think, you know, that's why I felt strongly about starting with middle and high school students from the outward stakeholders, because I want to hopefully help shift the culture, at least at my own personal institution. And this is not something I'm obviously not doing alone. There's huge amounts of people who are really involved in doing this work, so that we can build in better mentoring, better hiring practices, more sort of like incentives in tenure and promotion, right? Not just about the papers or the grants, but also about service, building in childcare, making sure people are getting paid correctly, you know, that, you know, the pay level isn't necessarily skewed because of somebody's, you know, identity factor. And so those are, that climate is definitely being scrutinized right now. I think this summer was we needed this wake up call hundreds of years ago. But I guess I don't even, it's starting to happen actually at scale right now. And so I do feel very optimistic about the future. It's a lot of work and it's going to be a long road, but I think we're moving in the right direction, and we're finally moving beyond the snail's pace. So I hope that answers your question. But I absolutely agree. Retention is a huge issue.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks, DJ. Danielle, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for such a great presentation. So can you tell us a little bit more about your transition from being a postdoc to your current role? Like, even as a grad student, many of the things you talked about, like, I'm really interested in, but I'm trying to envision, how do I go from where I'm at now to being able to do that as my work daily?
Yeah. My situation is a little, my friends call it the unicorn, because it's not something that is a normal like path, right? So when I was a postdoc, what I discovered as a postdoc is I love organizing people. I love bringing people together, and I love science, right? And so I'm like, I want to do both of those things together. And I would, you know, I led a bunch of the like initiatives on campus. Like I used to run like the biotech forum. I ran like the science communication group. I built discussion series, and I hosted events like crazy. And when it sort of became time for me and I really developed and honed a ton of skills in that sort of volunteer activities that served me so well, because I basically wrote a proposition to the president of Rockefeller, and I was like, we need much better science communication and science outreach initiatives on this campus. We need to really engage our communities in ways that are meaningful and just start, you know, taking a sledgehammer to this ivory tower. And here are 3 things that we can do right now, and hire me to do this. And our president was like, okay. And I was like, that worked, you know? And so like, I did that, and a week later I became director of science outreach, and it was because I asked for it. And so I can't guarantee that you're gonna get somebody to say yes to you. It was, you know, for me, it was a lot of timing and luck, and sort of like, I already built this name brand around the work I had done in all of these other spaces over the years. And I developed my skill of sort of packaging and communicating things to make a strong case. And that has actually kept me, that is a skill that I kept on developing over time, so that now I write grants and get them, not just write grants, you know? But for a while I was just writing grants. And so I think, you know, that transition for me was surprising. It was a Hail Mary toss. But the landscape of science outreach is actually changing. There's a lot of people considering centralization at their own universities and institutions. There's a lot of people putting a lot of, they're investing in these types of things. And I'm seeing science outreach jobs pop up in a number of different places and at multiple levels, right? Like, for example, the New York Genome Center has just posted 2 positions in science outreach. They never had science outreach before now. And so there's a huge interest in this. And I don't know, Danielle, if you have other sort of more specific areas for me to talk about, but I maybe that is an adequate answer, possibly.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. So basically, even at this grad student level, as we're like one of the things we're considering as we're going through the fellowship is, you know, what we want to do and the impact we want to make, but also what is this process and the time we're dedicating doing for us in our careers, and how is it helping us where we want to go?
Yes.
So I'm thinking about like the project that I have in mind that I'm working on. It's something that I really feel excited and like I want to put so much time into it. So I'm thinking it's like, but still I'm working in the lab and being a grad student. So it's like putting enough time to really make it something good. And in that, it's an investment because it's something that I've done. Like, it's something that I've gained skills through, but still just maintaining that balance because
it's tough. It's tough. Yeah.
So yeah, definitely just keep working, and, you know, hopefully something.
Well, one of the things I want to advocate for moving ahead, and this is not necessarily my idea, but it's an idea that I am latching onto, is, you know, when we think of science, we can't just think about bench work or field work or, you know, science proper. We also have to think about the ecosystem of science. And I would love to see graduate students who are deeply involved in sort of these service activities to have a chapter in their thesis dedicated to it. And I think that should be allowed. So like when DJ had sort of suggested like how do you think about shifting the culture? You know, how do we think about longevity? I think we have to show that if we obviously all want this to happen, but I don't want there to just be a pat on my back and say, good job, Jeanne, right? I want value associated with it, right? And so how do we promote value? And if that can be incorporated in the body of work that you report out to people, you know, through this thesis, like that should be in there, because this was part of the ecosystem and the work that you did. So I don't know if that's a possibility for you, but maybe talking to your dean or your PI, maybe that's something that you can do this way, that you feel that the time that is required for building a project like this can be, oh, you asked, I'm sorry, that's lame. I don't know, maybe we can figure out a way to like build an international petition and just be like, look at this, everybody wants it, you know? But this is something that I'm trying to push at Rockefeller, so.
This is great. I was going to say the NSF broader impact section sets the framework for you, Danielle, and others to even approach maybe your committees and the deans and saying, listen, this is already required at this level. The NIH, maybe they're still working on it. Could we use that framework, right, to then ask for this chapter? Jeanne, I love the idea. It's just phenomenal. Like, why not? Why not?
Exactly. Why not? This is work that people are doing, you know? Sorry, I'm getting a little soapboxy. I apologize. But also, no, I don't apologize.
I was gonna, okay, DJ, I think you already asked the question before, right? Oops, maybe your hand is still raised, but
yeah, I had a second question unless nobody else had their hand raised, but I don't want to take anyone else's time.
Go ahead, DJ.
So as someone who's a director of science outreach, do you see ways that your program and other programs can measure inclusivity? So you talk about how you can measure diversity pretty easily. People just kind of check boxes, but kind of thinking on the broader scale of like, are there ways to measure how included in a community somebody feels? I mean, there's easy ways that you can think of, like retention rates for students from different groups and like student satisfaction rates, but those feel pretty superficial. And I was wondering if that's something you've talked about and considered.
Yeah, we actually think about this a lot, right? And so I think what you're referring to is very quantitative metrics, sort of numbers and trajectories and things like that. But where I think the meat of all of this really exists is in some qualitative assessments. So interviews, sort of thinking about climate surveys, you know, things like that. And so one of the things that, at least for me and my community as a biomedical researcher, is like the idea of qualitative research feels very like, how do we build a t-test out of that, right? And so I think, you know, people are starting to really value that qualitative aspect, and interviews are where it's at for me.
It's a good point, especially when you're thinking about grants as well, right? It's always kind of scary to put the qualitative thing in there, but I think thinking about diverse instruments that you're using to assess impact. Right?
Yeah, you want to have a variety of instruments, I think, to make a very strong and rigorous case.
Right. I do want to ask a question. So, Jeanne, Rocky, you didn't just, I'll reframe my question. Rosario, go ahead.
You can ask your question if you want. I can wait.
No, it's okay. No, this is important that you guys get a chance to ask. Go ahead.
So my question was a little bit similar to Danielle's question, which was that how did you kind of transition from what started out as probably kind of independent projects, things that you were really interested in, to actually kind of program development? Because I think that, at least where I am right now, is I'm kind of at this line where I'm not quite, my project isn't taken as seriously as I'd like it to be. And I'm not quite sure how to take it to the next step, at least in the, as of the community that I work in. I feel like, I mean, because I get actually a decent amount of institutional support and support from other faculty, but kind of from the people who matter.
Yes, I know, the decision makers, the money givers, you know, the space makers. Yeah, I totally understand that. That has been a super long and difficult road for me, if I'm being perfectly transparent. You know, Rockefeller is a weird place because there's sort of like a flat structure, and people often just do what they want. And my personality is a very ask for forgiveness, never ask for permission. And there was an empty lab, and it was empty for a while, and I just moved in, and I was like, this is my lab now. And I just was bold, but I realized that that's not, and then what happened was there was like a little administrative turnover, and they didn't know that it wasn't actually my lab. And so I was just like, can I get a sign for our lab? Can we get a placard? And they were like, yeah, okay. So that's how I got Rocky DU Lab, is I just made it happen. And like, you know, it helps to be a little bit of I'm an older sister, you know, I like tell people what to do all the time. And I think, you know, I leverage sort of like the sort of outgoing Bronx, you know, kid that is just going to tell people what to do. And it was kind of cool because people didn't know the wiser. And, but I think for like just getting like more respect and value, it took a lot of relationship building, It took a lot of sort of, I would try to find like, hey, can you, HR, when you're onboarding employees, can you let me give a little spiel? Or when grad students are coming in from orientation, I want to meet with all of them. Or, you know, when HOLs are having, or PIs, we call them HOLs at Rockefeller, which is too fancy for my life. But when PIs are, you know, gathering, can I get in there? Or I would try to have one-on-one meetings with people, or find people who could advocate on my behalf, find mentors and peers and networks from outside of my institution. And so I know we're running out of time, Rosario, but maybe you can connect with me later on, and I can sort of brainstorm a lot of that with you. I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's a great question. And Jeanne's email is in the curriculum, so you guys can definitely.
Yeah.
Just to ask this question regarding, like, Rocky, you started small, and over time you've grown into this really impressive place that you've created. What have been the key lessons along the way, right? In terms of team building, in terms of making it work, right? Because
it does.
Creating these initiatives right now, and each one has a, they're thinking about teams and how are we actually going to execute this and make it grow. What have been your lessons, at least some key lessons along the way?
So I've always been able to gather people, and I've always been able to hit it home with the outward audiences. But the thing that I really, really needed to learn how to do was manage my own team. And that has been an area of growth for me in a very significant way, is knowing how to recognize, what are the inherent traits and skills that a particular individual on my team has, and then how can we leverage those, but also making sure they don't get bored, and also making sure that they can grow in their role. And so I've structured, I have a couple of people, and all of the members on my team, they work in so many different ways. And so when I have like my meetings with them, people are approaching things in all sorts of different ways. And sometimes I'm like, how do I bring this all together? And I think for me, what really resonates is to not put anybody in a position that feels unnatural, to always make sure that the work that they are doing is aligned with their own specific interests. Yeah, they're gonna have to like do some of that boring stuff here and there. Everybody's gonna have to do that boring stuff here and there. But majority of their work, can they get behind it? Do they feel inspired by that? And how am I checking in? So I check in with them all the time. I am, and as an example, I had to shift gears for this pandemic, and I'm totally changing the role of one of my people because I'm asking them, are you happy doing this? How can we think about ways to do things a little bit differently so that I am maintaining the goals of the program while also accommodating what you need to feel successful in this role? And so I do a lot of tailoring of the environment to make sure that my people feel that I value their work. They feel that they can come to me with problems. Again, this normalization of feedback is really huge. I'm very direct with everybody, and they know not to, I'm never mean, and I always try to be kind, but I will give you full on like, sorry, that is not taking place. Don't ask again, right? But in like respectful ways. I want them to feel respected, and I want them to push me and know that I will push them in return. And that's that mutual respect. So.
Yeah, I think that's so important. We're gonna have Latasha Wright later.
She's my best friend.
Five of us.
Like for real. Yeah, she and I we talk almost like 3 or 4 times a day. I mean, a week. She and I are like, we're total, I know this is like TMI, but like we're besties. So yeah.
Confirmed today, so that's why I'm telling you.
She's awesome. She's amazing. She's one of my peer. We're like peer mentors for each other.
Because all these things like leadership. Because to Danielle's question earlier about how do you incorporate this into thesis, and Jeanne, you're talking about organization. You're emailing the president of Rockefeller asking for things, right? Yeah. I think this is where building these things, you come into the table, you're showcasing, here is some preliminary stuff I'm building, working on.
Yeah.
I think that totally helps, and I'm hopeful that as this space, right, for graduate students and even postdocs too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been there. We're a forgotten group.
Help them, exactly, because I did the same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those insights.
Oh, it was such a pleasure speaking with all of you. And please, I encourage you, if anybody wants to talk about anything further, I never say no to meetings. I'd be happy to schedule something where we could talk for an hour and brainstorm or connect you. And or if there's something that like you have a challenge and I'm not the right person, there's a chance I can direct you to the right person. So I don't know I know very little sometimes. And so we can find people who know more than me.
Thank you, Jeanne.